Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this very special occasion. I believe it's the fourth event that we've organized as part of Torah Refuah. And we are very honored that Rabbi Bixenspanner has agreed to give us his first in a series of shiurim on Hilchot Shabbat. And I think the Rav doesn't really need my introduction, but just for those of our participants from abroad, the Rav is a senior posek, he's a Rav of Henden Adas, he's a mechaber of many sefarim on many different areas of Halacha, and he's been, to me personally, many doctors locally throughout COVID, has been a pillar of support in many different ways with his wise counsel, and I'm very privileged that he agreed to be part of this program of Torah Refuah, where we have been able to organize many events. Baruch Hashem, have put together many senior doctors and Rabbanim and Dayanim together. And again, I just wanted to thank him. He's been a great supporter of this from the very beginning. And I really intend for this to be as interactive as possible. So I know it's difficult if people are, trying to do other things maybe on a Wednesday evening, but it'd be really good if people can have their cameras on. And please feel free to post any questions in the chat box or put your hand up virtually. And the Rav is very happy to answer any burning questions that come up during the shiur. I'll hand over to Rabbi Bixenspanner.
Okay, so good evening to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kahan for giving me this opportunity to be able to share some divrei Torah with such a prominent group of doctors. As Alicia mentioned, the last few months, or almost a year, more than a year, we've been very involved in many different aspects of refuah, of medicine, and especially things that were related to COVID. And sort of Alicia dragged me into this unwillingly. It all started on a Shabbos morning during the height of lockdown. More than a year ago, he came knocking on my door. He had a few questions, and it went on for over 2 hours that we were talking, and that's when it all started. And Baruch Hashem, as we know that the Torah is very vast, there are many different aspects, but the inyan of refuah is something which is a constant. There's always new chidushim, there's always new things, and it's one of those things that you can't just rest on your laurels and say, okay, I already know, because literally every hour there are new things that come up, and new studies and new findings. And it's something that you always have to be on your toes. And that's what basically Alicia has been doing for over a year now, that he's kept me on my toes in this aspect. So I just would like to start with, we find in the Gemara that before you start a sugya, you should say Musa de Bedichase, something light. So I would like to share a story with the Olam that they say over in the name of Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky. Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky was once sitting by a chasana, and we're talking about pre-COVID, and it was jam-packed, and the head table, the top table as they call it here in England, was full. There was not an empty seat, and all of a sudden in walks a doctor, and he came in with an attitude that, everyone is waiting for him and everyone owes him. And he basically made a beeline straight to the top table. He comes to the top table and there's no room for him. And finally, the mechutin, the Baal Simcha, was very uncomfortable. So he went over to a Rosh HaKoilel that he only was a Rosh HaKoilel in the afternoon, in the second Seder. So he asked him if he would mind to go, in a different place, to vacate this place for this doctor. And he didn't have much choice. So he said, sure. So the doctor sat himself down, looking around, and he looked all choshev, all prominent. Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky was very upset. He felt that, what's going on here? Kvod HaTorah, how could you push away someone that's already sitting because of a doctor? So in his typical style, he made a drosha, he gave a speech, and he said that, we saw here something which, is very interesting, that this doctor felt that it contained covered, people owe him the cover, the honor. So he said, if you take a look in the Gemara in many places, in Chulin, in Baba Metzia, the Gemara says that Shmuel, the Amoira Shmuel, he was a very big doctor. And the Gemara in Baba Metzia says that there were certain machlas that no one knew like Shmuel. Shmuel was considered a very, very big doctor in his time. So the question is, besides being a doctor, he was also an Amoira. He was also, we know that Hilchasa Kishmul Bedini, that any time you have a Shaila in Choshe Mishpat, in any of the Bovas, in any Masech and Seder Nezikin, and Shmuel is Amanda Omar, and he has a machloikis with others, we pass him like Shmuel. So the question is, why was he never called Reb Shmuel? Why do we call him by his first name? So Rabbi Yaakov said the reason is as follows. We know that the Gemara says that when a person has a choice between a father or a Rebbe, let's say it comes to Aveda, Shavas Aveda, Avedas Oviv, Vavedas Rabbi. So the din is Avedas Rabbi Koidem. Why is Avedas Rabbi Koidem? Because Oviv Meviyoi L'chai Oilam Hazeh, and Rabbi is Meviyoi L'chai Oilam Haba. So said Rabbi Yaakov, when it comes to doctors, we're not looking for doctors that bring people to Olam Haba. We need doctors that help people stay in Olam Hazeh. So that is why Shmuel didn't want to be called Reb, because the concept of Reb reminds us that it's Meviyoi L'chai Olam Haba, and that's good for Rabbonim, but that for a doctor we need someone that's going to keep them in Olam Hazeh. So that's why Shmuel didn't want to go with the name Reb. So he says this doctor that considers himself so choshev that he belongs on the top table and everyone has to give him covered. We're not so sure exactly what type of a doctor that is, but that's what he said. Then Rabbi Yaakov also explained something which I'm sure sometimes doctors think about it. The Gemara says toiv sheberoifim legehenim. So the question is, why is the toiv sheberoifim legehenim? So he said that a doctor, sometimes you see it, that they believe in themselves and they're so egoistic about it. I once heard many years ago, I was still in Toronto, and I was dealing with some issue, and I spoke to the chief in the hospital there, Mount Sinai Hospital, and he told me, "You don't worry. This guy is cured. If I'm dealing with it, he's cured." He spoke literally like he's, the kavayochel alein, as they say. And Lamaisa, a doctor knows that, yes, he has, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave him certain koiches and certain things, but it's be'etzem, it's verape yerape, mikan shenitten reshus l'roifa l'rapois. Where does it play itself out? It plays itself out when it comes to davening. So in davening, we have one of the brachas is the bracha of Refa'enu. So the question is, how much does a doctor have kavana when it comes to Refa'enu? So if he's someone that believes in himself, he's a narcissist, he believes in his koiches, which unfortunately can happen. So by Refa'enu, he doesn't have much kavana, because to him, he's the one who heals the person. But when someone believes in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then even by Refa'enu, he's mechaven. So it says Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky, Toiv sheberoifim, we know that there are Yud-Ches brachas, Shmoina Esrei. Toiv is Gematria 17. So a doctor that's a Toiv sheberoifim, that he only has in mind by 17 brachas out of the 18, legehenim, because that's not a doctor's job. A doctor's job is verape yerape, but there still is the divine help that a doctor needs, and the malach refoel, etc., that if someone gets carried away to think that by him it's enough the toiv, the 17, then such a guy belongs legehenim. And be'etzem, we do find something fascinating, the Rambam in Hilchas Malva Veloiva, where he talks about trusted people. So we have a Gemara that some people will only trust Talmid Chachamim, etc. The Rambam adds Oy Roifim. That's the Lashon Rambam. The Rambam is in Hilchas Malva Veloiva, where the Rambam says as follows. I have here the Lashon Rambam. The Rambam says, "Im Omar al tifraenu elo b'fnei talmid chacham," which means that someone says, "I'm lending you money, but I'm stipulating that you shouldn't repay me only in front of a talmid chacham." Oy b'fnei roifim. So the question is, why does the Rambam add roifim? So some say because the Rambam was a roifa himself, and obviously the Rambam was a very prominent person. But the emes is the Rambam wanted to give a chashivus to roifim, because we do find many times in Chazal that they had to rely on roifim. There's a Gemara in Masechtas Nazir. They brought in a basket of bones of a deceased person, and they put it in there. And a certain doctor came in, and his whole entourage with interns and students. They testified that this is not enough to be matama, like a mess would be matama. So we see that the Chachamim relied on doctors. And then we have a Gemara Masechtas Nida, where there was a shaila with something that a woman saw. So she came to the Beis HaMedrash, and she asked the Chachamim. The Chachamim, says the Gemara, Sha'alu l'roifim, and basically they relied on what the roifim had to say. So we see that a roifa plays a very important role in the whole concept in Yiddishkeit and in many different aspects. They say that in the city of Preshborg, which is the city of the Chassam Sofer, on Yom Kippur, if they would call up a doctor for an aliyah, they would call him Moreinu. Why would they call him Moreinu? Because on Yom Kippur, the doctor becomes like the Rav, because even the Rav who paskens Shailas Lagaba Yom Kippur needs the input of a doctor in order to help him to say whether this person should fast or not. So the minig was that on Yom Kippur, they would call him up as Moreinu. And the emes is, sometimes when it comes to bris milah, the doctor is also the one who decides whether you can make a bris, you can't make a bris. So maybe, if there's a bris and you call up a doctor for an aliyah, you should call him Moreinu. So anyway, this is as far as the Milsa de Bedichas is concerned. Now, there's a very big concern, or maybe, I'm not sure if doctors are familiar with it, but a few years ago, there was a certain individual that sent out letters to many Rabbonim. And basically, his pitch was that, today it's impossible to become a doctor unless you work on Shabbos. And that's unique for England. Maybe now it's different, but when I was still in Canada, that wasn't the case, because you did have an option of swapping and switching. But here in England, it's impossible to become a doctor unless you work on Shabbos. Now, the question is that if someone is already a doctor and now he has a situation where he has to work on Shabbos, then l'chayra, we'll see soon, what the heterim are. But his inyan was that that people should start off learning to become a doctor in England. Maybe they should go to Eretz Yisrael, maybe they should go to other places where you don't have to do that and then come back to England. Now, this whole thing is something which needs to be discussed, because the emes is that we do find a very interesting psak from the Mishnah Berurah, which some may be familiar with, and we'll see what the reaction of other poskim are. So we'll start off with the words of the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Shin Lamed, where he speaks about the inyan of a midwife. So the Shulchan Aruch says that obviously, if a woman is in labor, she's going to give birth, so you can be Mechal Shabbos because the Yoledas is considered a Choyle Sheyesh Bo Sakana. But if it's a non-Jewish woman that's in labor, Ein Miyald Noise B'Shabbos, Afile B'Dova She'ein Bo Chilul Shabbos. That's the Shulchan Aruch, and it's based on a Gemara in Masechtas Avodah Zarah. And there the Gemara speaks about Avodah Zarah, and basically what the gist of the sugya is that the reason why in the weekday you're allowed to be a midwife for a non-Jewish woman, even if there's a chashash of Avodah Zarah, is mishum eva, which means that if you start making differentiation between Jews and non-Jews, you can get into very big trouble. But that's only in the weekday. But on Shabbos, the Gemara says that Yechoyle lehishtamet v'loymar ei mechalel Shabbos kim lahu deminter Shabbat. In other words, we can tell them a story that we are only mechalel Shabbos on someone that's a shomer Shabbos. That's what the Gemara says. So says the Magen Avraham. But if there's Eva, which means that the Goyim won't buy that, because in the times of the Gemara, maybe they bought it because they were much more religious, so maybe they were able to identify with such a type of a behavior that, we only mechal Shabbos with someone that's a shomer Shabbos. But if that doesn't work, says the Magen Avraham, you can be mechal Shabbos because there's Eva. Now, says the Magen Avraham, according to the Magen Avraham, it depends what type of Chil Shabbos there is, because the Shulchan Aruch says that Stamazo you shouldn't do it afile b'dava she'ein bo chilul. The Magen Avraham says that if it's ein bo chilul, then you're allowed to. So the Magen Avraham implies that if there is Chilul Shabbos, then it's also. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Veda da roifim bizmanenu. So he's talking about 100 years ago, or a bit more than 100 years ago. Afila yoser kisherim, even the Erlicha doctors, einam nezarim b'zeh klal. The masim b'chol Shabbos shenoisim kama parsois. They travel around l'rapos oivdei kechovim. V'koizvin, and they write, v'shoichin samamonim, they grind herbs, ba'atzmon, v'ein lohem al masha yismoichu, da'afila im nema demuta l'chal Shabbos v'issa d'rabonon mishum eva, even if we're going to say that more than the Shulchan Aruch, that's not matter at all, we're going to say that, yes, you can do mishum eva, but that's only when there's an issa d'rabonon involved. But if it's an issa d'raisa, says the Magen Avraham, says the Mishnah Berurah, bevadai also l'kula alma, that's the words of the Mishnah Berurah. Now, Lamaisa, the fact is that in today's day and age, this doesn't fly. In other words, mitzad morality, mitzad, the way the world works is that you can't discriminate just because of someone's beliefs and someone's religion. And Rav Moshe Feinstein, in his Igros Moshe, he asks on the Magen Avraham, and he says, I don't understand. Not the Magen Avraham, the Mishnah Berurah. He says that how could the Mishnah Berurah say such a thing? And especially he says in Russia, in the times of the Mishnah Berurah, if you wouldn't go about healing everyone, they would kill you. And that's a typical case of Eva, which you're allowed to do even Chilul Shabbos D'Oraisa. And that is the view of many other poskim. There's a whole tshuva in the Divrei Yatziv from the Klosenberger Rebbe, who he's the one who established the Laniado Hospital in Netanya. So he also writes that in today's day and age, that doesn't work. And someone that's a doctor on shift and he's on duty, anyone that comes, you have to heal regardless of their religion and their background. So this is something which is very much accepted today as a psak, that if someone is on duty, a doctor is on duty, then they have to do what they have to do, even if it's for a non-Jewish person. Now, the same inyan of Eva applies to the concept of studying medicine. Now, it's obvious that if a person has the ability, easily to go to study medicine in a place where you don't have to come onto Chilul Shabbos, avada matoivu manoim. No one says that there's a chiyuv to be mechal Shabbos if you have another choice, but not always is it a choice. And not to have Jewish doctors is not an option, because there are many, many reasons why our community needs from Jewish doctors on the scene. And besides of the fact of the sensitivity that they have, to treating patients, but there's also, unfortunately, today in the hospitals, the whole concept of how they treat the elderly and all these type of things, the balance and that the Jewish doctors bring in and the sensitivity to life that they bring in definitely mitigates some of the behavior that they would behave in without it. So having Jewish doctors on the scene is extremely, extremely important. And to say that it should be usher because of Chil Shabbos that's involved, that's something that in the way the Metzias is today doesn't fly. And therefore, I feel, and many other poskim, that if someone has the ability and someone has the know-how of being a doctor, and it's something that they feel that talks to them, they should definitely pursue it. And even if it means having to be Mechal Shabbos, but nevertheless, there's definitely an inyan of Eva which is connected to this inyan. Now, just as an aside, I found a very interesting psak from the Mishnah Berurah, which we wouldn't associate with and we wouldn't understand. And in the times of the Mishnah Berurah, it was very, very common. And that sort of shows us that even when he wrote what he wrote, there must have been a certain metzias about doctors that we don't understand. Because let's first see the case, and then we'll see how these two halachas don't add up one to each other. So the Mishnah Berurah brings down b'nogeya, the inyan of people going out to help other kehillas or other individuals. We're talking about someone is in trouble on Shabbos, he's being pursued, or there's bandits that came to attack. So what is a Yid allowed to do on Shabbos? So the Shulchan Aruch says that obviously b'derech klal you only go on iskei nefashos because that's pikuach nefesh. Says the Mechaber, yesh misha oimer, that's in Shin Chavtes Siv Zayin, shebizman hazeh afilu bo al iskei momon, even if these bandits came only for money. In other words, they're not interested in lives. Mechalal, you mechalal Shabbos. Why? In other words, yes, initially he's coming only for money, but if things go bad, then chas v'shalom there could be pikuach nefesh, and therefore you can be mechalal Shabbos even on iskei momoin. Mikol makom, says the Ramah, hakol lefia inyan. Says the Mishnah Berurah that it all depends how angry they are and how wild they are. So that's something that you have to gauge based on each individual, case by case. V'da, says the Mishnah Berurah, b'hayoim kishabou me'ha'omay shechutz ligvulenu lishlol shalol v'lovas boy, that sometimes you have these bandits or Cossacks, whatever you want to call them, that they come to communities and they wreak havoc. Bevadai mechuyovim anu lotzes b'klei zayin. We're supposed to go out with arms. Al iskei momoin ikadina de malchusa. Why? The heichad ike chashash shema yichasu yoshvei haaretz aleinu. Because if we don't take part in going out and doing what we need to do in order to save the population from the mob, as we would call them, yichasu yoshvei haaretz aleinu, that the goyim will get angry at us that we didn't do our part, and because of that you can be mechal Shabbos. So you see right here that the Mishnah Berurah himself, when it comes to doctors, he's being machmer. When it comes to these type of things, he says that, I'm not going to say he's being mekel, because Adarab, he's being machmer as well. But there the chumrah is that pikuach nefesh is doicha Shabbos. Pikuach nefesh doicha Shabbos is not a kula, it's a chumrah, because that's what the Torah says. So l'chayra, how does that add up with what he says about doctors? The answer is there must be some kind of a metzias that we don't really know, because the way we would understand it, and that's the kasha of the Igros Moshe Feinstein, he says, imagine you have in a little town one doctor, and he's the one that's achroi on everyone. How could he say on Shabbos, I'm not working? So avada and avada, that the concept of Eva is something that would be matir even in Issa D'Oraisa. So even though in the Gemara it's clear, and in Tosfos there's the sugya in Avodah Zarah, it's very clear that Eva is only matir Issa Rabbanon, but that's only if you don't need more. But in a case where you need more, Avada and Avada, it's doicha, and therefore there should be no guilt associated with becoming a doctor, because becoming a doctor is something which is extremely, extremely important, and it's very much part of our Torah and very much part of what we need. Now, the big question here is, there are many different ways of how to approach what we're trying to achieve. But basically, I'm going to try to follow certain questions of a certain doctor that's like sort of training now and starting out. And basically, the big question is, how should a doctor set up his lifestyle, or how should he set up his behavior over Shabbos? Because the thing is that, there are many different heterim, many different scenarios, and one of the concerns that a doctor expressed was as follows. Yes, there are many different ways that you can do things with shinuyim, and there are many different ways of how you can do things in a way that can mitigate the inyan of Chilul Shabbos. However, it can also add unnecessary pressure on a doctor when he knows that he has to go through all these things. Let's take, for an example, a very simple example. Going into a hospital with electronic doors. So, let's say if someone is going to visit, so the advice you give them and the psak you give them is that stand by the door, wait for someone to come in or out, and then when the door opens for them, you come in with them. But imagine if we tell a doctor that, every time you have to go through such a door, which can be multiple times, because it's not only the front door, it's within the wards and et cetera, you have to wait. It can put a strain on a doctor in a way that he can lose his whole sensitivity. And the question is, what is an utmost necessary thing to do, and what, in other words, if you understand a bit the background of the different scenarios, it may give a better understanding. So what we want to try to achieve is more so than going into details, which obviously we're happy to go into details if anyone has specific questions. And Emetz Hashem, we're not going to cover everything in one shiur. But today I would like to focus a bit more on the actual setup and understanding certain aspects of the inyan of Pikuach Nefesh and Chilul Shabbos, etc. So I would like to start with someone that knows he has a shift on Shabbos, whenever that is, and they're going to the shift. Now, the question is, what are they allowed to do? Now, it's very obvious that when it comes to Pikuach Nefesh, that, especially if a Yid is involved, then the din is Hazar is Areza Meshubach, and you have to go in the fastest way possible. And that's something that applies to Hatzalah members. That's something that applies when someone is running and rushing to the hospital to save a life. But here we're talking about someone that knows that at 8 o'clock, that's when his shift starts. So he has to be in the hospital at 8 o'clock. So he has a choice of driving to the hospital at 7:45, or he can take public transport, at 7:15, or maybe taking a taxi at 7:30. So in other words, how should he set up his mahalach? How should he set up the system? What should he be doing? And how much time should he give himself before to get to the hospital on time? So obviously, if a person can, walking is the best option if that's shaykh. But there's no chiyuv for someone to walk and put extra strain on himself. Now, every place is different. Let's say, for example, if someone would be asking such a shaila in Borough Park, and they're working in Maimonides Hospital, which is in the city, which is so you have to walk a few blocks. So obviously, we will tell them, walk to the hospital and give yourself enough time to arrive there on time and to have a drink and to relax and to be able to start your shift refreshed. But not always is that an option. Here in Northwest London, you tell a doctor, even if they're working in Royal Free, which relatively is local, but it's still a walk, and by the time you get there, you can be all tired. So the question is, what should a person do? So there are many different levels. So taking a cab, taking a taxi is always less of a shaila than driving yourself, because driving yourself is an issa d'oraisa, and obviously that should be avoided. Taking a taxi, so yeah, besides the actual taxi, which is only an issa d'rabanan, but you have other aspects. There's handling money, and there's how you call the taxi. So the best way is to pre-book a taxi, or Uber. You can also pre-book, and this way, if it's Uber, the mila is that the mila of Uber is that there's no money handled, and if you can get the driver to open the door for you, which again is not necessary today. The most of the lights in the cars are LED lights, so they're not an issa d'oraisa per se, but nevertheless, all these different type of things mitigate the issur of chil Shabbos. So what we would say is that someone that lives relatively far from the hospital, that they should take a pre-booked taxi. Now the question is, some people ask, what's with public transport? Now public transport per se is not considered an issa d'oraisa according to most poskim, if any bichlal. And be'etzem, public transport, the only issue is carrying the Oyster card. Now if there's an eruv, then you can rely on the eruv if you choose to do so. But most of the hospitals are outside of the eruv. So the question is, you have the aspect of an issa d'rabanan of carrying the oyster. Now you can do it with a shinui, so that mitigates the issa d'rabanan. Once you have two issuri d'rabanan, then if it's a tzorech gadol, that could be allowed. So again, you have that option. But the problem with public transport is the maris ha'ayin aspect, because at the end of the day, people, if they see someone riding in a taxi on Shabbos, everyone knows that when you need, you go in a taxi. But if all of a sudden doctors would be going on public transport on Shabbos, that would definitely be a bigger chashash mitzad maris ha'ayin, and therefore it's not recommended. But again, to say that it's os isser gomer, you can't say that, because it's definitely the same level of issa d'rabanan than a taxi, and maybe a bit less, because it's a big bus or a big train. So one person doesn't add much to that aspect. A car is a bit, if it's driven by a non-Jew, is issa d'rabanan, and public transport is also an issa d'rabanan, but maybe even a bit less. But mitzad maris ha'ayin, I think that public transport should be avoided, and rather people should take a taxi. Now the question is there a chiyuv in any way, shape, or form for a person to stay there before Shabbos? In other words, someone says, maybe my shift starts a few hours into Shabbos, maybe I should stay there before Shabbos. Now, avada and avada, if someone can do it easily and it doesn't compromise him or his family in any way, then matoy v'manoim. In other words, there's no isser of doing it, but there's no need for any guilt, for a person to have guilt that they have to go on to the hospital on Shabbos in a oifen that's maybe an isser d'rabanan, because at the end of the day, we don't find that a person should have to put himself out of a comfort zone when it comes to such a thing. We have that shaila in the poskim by other things. Here we're talking about on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. But even if it's a one-off, we find in the poskim, let's say a woman that's in her 9th month, and her due date is around the Shabbos. Does she have to make accommodations that she should stay next to the hospital. This way, if she goes into labor, she can just walk over. And all the poskim say that there's no such chiyuv, because when it happens and when the matzav arises, that's when you deal with it as the halacha tells us to do. So therefore, there's no chiyuv of going to the hospital before Shabbos. I'm talking about in most cases is with a taxi. Obviously, if a person can walk, that's matoy v'manoim. But be'etzem, mitzad halacha, going with a taxi is considered an issa d'Rabbanan, and because it's an issa d'Rabbanan, l'tzorech choyle is definitely allowed, even a choyle she'ein bo sakana. So that's as far as the aspect of going to the hospital. Now, the question is, if a person has an emergency, and then avad and avada, that if it's for Yisrael, then you go the fastest way possible. But if it's l'tzorech akum, and let's say the choice is to drive or to take a taxi, now it depends what the derech ha'olam would be. From what I understand, in a hospital, there are doctors on call. In other words, it's not pshat that it's a code 99, as they call it, or code blue, that someone is dying and you're the only doctor that's coming to the hospital to look after this patient. There are doctors on call. They may be residents, they may be, not such experienced doctors, but it's not pshat that you have to go, as fast as possible. What would a doctor do in such a case? So I would understand that they'll get there as soon as they get there. Like I know for a fact that in Manhattan, many doctors ride bikes because there's a lot of traffic. So they live wherever they live in Manhattan, and they have to go to the hospital. They go by bike. So even if they get a call that their patient is in labor and they have to come right away, they're not going to come flying with an ambulance. They do it with a bike, because that's accepted. So if that's accepted, then there's no chiyuv of doing more than what would be the norm. If it's tamazoid. So if the norm is like let's say, for example, right, the whole reason why Hatzalah was founded is because in the Goyish Welt, for an ambulance to come within 30 minutes, that's normal, even if the person is having a heart attack, and that's something which in the Torah we find that you do it quicker. So when a doctor has to get to the hospital for an emergency, when a Yid is involved, then you do it the quickest way possible, even if it means driving yourself. But if a Yid is not involved, then you can go with a cab, you can go with any way that you would go, regularly, even if it's an emergency. Now, I wanted to touch upon the concept of returning. Now, this is something which is a very, very big question, and that is, what is a person allowed to do? They finish their shift and they want to come home. So there's a very big machloikis in the poskim. If a person went bershus, which means he went to Mimachal Shabbos in a oifen that it's mutter, and the question is, may he come back with Chil Shabbos or not? So just to give a bit of background and a few Mara Makoimas, so I wanted to mention as follows. The Magen Avraham discusses a concept of hitiru soifan mishum tchilosan, which means that Chazal understood the way people work, that if people are put into an uncomfortable situation, they will try to avoid it the next time. And because of that, certain things they were matir soifan at the end mishum tchilosan, that people won't bother to begin with. So, but the Magen Avraham says that the heter of hitiru soifan mishum tchilosan is only by an issa d'Rabbanan. You can only be matir in issa d'Rabbanan. Now, the big question is, what would a doctor be allowed? Would a doctor be allowed to come back, technically speaking, by doing an issa d'oraisa? So Lemaisa, the only one that's matir such a thing is there's a tshuva in Igros Moshe where a Moshe wants to be matir such a thing yitir soifa mishum tchilosan, even when it's negeya and issa deraisa. But lemaisa, most poskim argue on him, and they feel that it should only be allowed when it's an issa derabanan. So because we have an option of coming home by taxi, so a taxi, as we said before, is only an issa derabanan. So avada and avada, there's a heter for a doctor to come back with a taxi. Driving should be avoided, because most poskim hold that itir soifim shim tchilosan is not a heter by an issa deraisa. Now, there are some that want to argue that hitir soifim shim tchilosan is not for everything. Like, for example, where do we find the hitir soifim shim tchilosan? So the Shulchan Aruch speaks about. I mean, it's the makar is the sugi Masechtas Rosh Hashanah, that the people that went out to testify for Kiddush HaChodesh, they were given concessions that they were allowed to move around. Even though they went chutz l'tchum, they were allowed to go to walk around. They had 2,000 amas, a shiur tchum, even though they shouldn't have had, because it's called yotza b'rishus. So some want to argue that you see in the Shulchan Aruch that it's only mutter that they should go around where they are, but mehecha teisi that they can come back to their city on Shabbos. Now the emes is, if you take a look in Shulchan Aruch, there are two places where the Shulchan Aruch speaks about this inyan of metir soifa mishum tchilosan. One of them is in Hilchas Tchumen, Eruva Tchumen, in Siman Tov Zayin, and there it says that be'etzem, they have alpaim amal ruach, which means they have a tchum Shabbos, even though they shouldn't have had, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Now, Lamaisa, in Siman Shin Chavtes, the Mechaber doesn't even say that. The Mechaber says, Kol hayotzim lahatzel, choyzrim b'klei zayinom l'mekoimom, that they can come back, and it doesn't give the option of staying there, just making yourself comfortable where you are. So the argument that some poskim say is that the Shulchan Aruch only gives a concession of making a person comfortable where they are, as opposed to coming back. That's true for Siman Tov Zayin. But if you look in Siman Shin Chavtes, you clearly see that Shulchan Aruch doesn't even give that option. The option is right away they should come back. So it all depends what the situation is. Now, the way I see it, imagine if, let's say, you have a whole group of people, right? They hear that there are bandits, a mob in a certain city. So a bunch of people run to help out that city. So now they came to a different city. They're chutz l'tchum. So be'etzem, the din is that ein lahem elo dalad amas. They only have their dalad amas. And Chazal said, you know what? We don't want to deter them from next time. So we're giving them a concession. They can move around. So that's, when you have a whole group of chevra that Baruch Hashem or Matzliach, they saved the city from the mob. Now they're being offered cholent and beer, and they're having a good time, and there's beautiful company. So we say, stay there. Why are you rushing home? But if someone is alone and there's a family waiting, then we don't find that a person has a chiyuv to stay where he was, even if we're going to allow him to make him comfortable. But a person wants to go home. And besides the fact that this is an ongoing situation, the case in the Shulchan Aruch is a one-off. So a person, is away from his house for one Shabbos. But if it happens all the time, then it's very hard to say that in halacha there's no mokum for it. So be'etzem, according to many poskim, and that's how I feel as well, is that an issa d'rabbanan you for sure can do. And because we have a choice of taking a cab, then, and obviously you can either pre-book it or you can have some kind of arrangement about payment. But even that, as I said, is an issa d'rabbanan. It's another issa d'rabbanan. So isure d'rabbanan you can definitely do hitiru soifa mishum tchilosan. There's another thing which comes up very often, especially here in Northwest London. So many times you have people that have relatives in hospital, and they want to go on Shabbos, and sometimes the question arises, what happens when they want to come back? Now, there are some people who will be machmir and they'll walk back. And I remember in Toronto, many people would walk back because the hospital, one of them was 45 minutes away, not the end of the world, and you're walking in a relatively safe place. But here in London, in Northwest London, the route from the Royal Free to Northwest London, depending what time of the day, but at night, is not something that is recommended for anyone because it's not safe. You have to go through the Heath, whatever they call it, the West Heath, whatever they call it, and it's not a safe place. So I do tell people that they should come back by taxi because it's the same din of itir soifim mishum tchilosan. Now there is an argument to say that when do we say itir soifim mishum tchilosan? When we're talking choishes that people won't go, but many poskim argue, right? If let's say that's not how we do it, Hatzalah members come back with non-Jews, no problem. But imagine if we would tell Hatzalah member that they have to walk back from wherever the call is. Would we say that the Hatzalah member wouldn't go again? He's part of Hatzalah because that's what he wants to do. So oy bazoi. Some poskim argue that how dare you say that about a fellow Yid that he wouldn't go again. But Lamaisa, this argument was not accepted. And the Metzias is that people would definitely think twice to become a Hatzalah member. And even if you have a family member in hospital, which then you also have an argument why you think that they won't go again. If you don't let them drive back, they won't go. It's their loved one. It's someone that they want to go to hospital. But nevertheless, we do find in the poskim that there is such a heter, and if it's only an issa d'Rabbanan, you can definitely rely on the many poskim who say that one can come back with a taxi. Now,
is it possible for me, sorry to interrupt, is it possible to ask a couple of the questions that have been put in the chat box?
Yes. So I just wanna summarize what we learned about today, and in Yetz Hashem, the next time, whenever that will be, we will discuss a few more aspects, and just want to summarize that, and then we'll take questions. So what we spoke about today, besides the fact that we feel that having from Jewish doctors is something very important, but we also discussed that a doctor needs to know how he should set up his Mahalach HaChaim and how his shift should look like, how he should get there, he should think about how he's coming home. So the importance of that is because usually the way it works is that a person sets himself up in a certain way, and that's how he behaves, for the rest of his career. As Shlomo HaMelech says in his ultimate wisdom, that's the nature of a person, that the way a person sets himself up in his younger years, that's how he's going to continue practicing. So it's extremely, extremely important for a doctor, especially one that's starting out, that he should know what his rights are in halacha, and he should also understand that even though sometimes there could be chumras that a person can follow, but sometimes those chumras will drive him crazy that he'll drop everything. So that's why it's very important to set out exactly what is allowed, what's not allowed, and where there is some wiggle room to use kulas. Now, at the same time, a person has to be careful not to become a kal, as they say in the name of Chassam Sofer, that to be a mekil is nothing wrong, but a person shouldn't become a kal. And if a person loses their sensitivity to Hilchas Shabbos, that's also a terrible thing. I just wanted to share a short story that I heard from one of our from doctors, that he said he remembers when he was doing internship in Eretz Yisrael, in Hadassah, and he had a practice of, he had an Arab with him that would write down whatever he needed to write down. And there was a certain doctor who was a more senior, who was making fun of all these shinuyim and all these chumras. He had his mahalach. So he says he remembers how he once came to this doctor on Shabbos with a report that the Arab had written for him. And this doctor took out a pen and wrote Toda with an exclamation mark. like, thank you. That has no room at all in halacha on Shabbos to write todah on a form. So that only shows that this doctor became so used to the Chilul Shabbos that he totally lost his sensitivity. And that's something that we shouldn't do. And I have a whole shtickle Torah, which I'll have to leave for next time, where we find this concept of even if a person has to sort of come onto b'di'evet, but you cannot allow the b'di'evet to become a lekatchila, because that's what the Gemara says, nasa lekeheter, that if a person loses his, he crosses one line, then he's up to the next line, and then slowly but surely he's crossing all kinds of lines. So in Yetz Hashem, this will be the focus in the next year, to go through the different ways of how to go through doors, and what is a best practice, so to speak, for doctors to engage in. And now I would like to give the floor to Alicia for some questions.
Thank you, Rav. Thank you very much indeed. Electrical cars. There's an option with Uber now, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can now order an electric car. I think it might be slightly more expensive. No, it might be, might not be. But let's say it's the same price. Is there any preference in ordering an electric car if you have the option over a regular diesel or petrol car?
So from what I understand, an electric car also uses gas. In other words,
no gas. There's no gas whatsoever.
Which one?
No gas.
Hybrid. It's not.
Not hybrid.
Yeah,
So I'm talking about purely electric car. There's no petrol, diesel, gas, whatever. Nothing.
It's something I have to look into, because I'm not familiar with the way it works, if there's fire or not. But because it's a non-Jewish driver, I mean, even if, let's say, it doesn't make any difference, it's still the same as a regular car. But it's a very good question, but I don't know the Metzias well enough to be able to answer. So I would have to look into it.
Fine. Another question is, in some doctors' experience, that taxis are not always practical because of the lights on the doors and the driver not being able to find without calling the individual, and the shift not ending at the expected time. Sometimes it overruns, and so public transport would be a slightly preferable option for some doctors in those circumstances. So in a circumstance like that, would the doctor be able to use his own discretion and take public transport, or would we have to say no? It's always best to.
So again, it all depends on the circumstance. As I said, mitzat halacha, public transport is not more of a problem than a taxi. It's just from the Maris Ayin aspect of it, and Maris Ayin is something which is again another Issa D'Rabbanan. So it all depends on the situation. So therefore, I would say that if push comes to shove, then they can do public transport, but they should try to avoid it as much as possible.
What about traveling to a hospital outside the Tchum? I'm sure this is probably something that needs a bit more.
Yeah. So again, we're talking about oifen that he has a heter to do even Chilul Shabbos. So if he has a heter to do Chilul Shabbos, then what's the question? Whether he should.
Is a person able to, or is the? Well, I mean, what?
If that's where his shift is, and that's what his duty is, and that's what he needs to do, then that's what he needs to do.
Fine. So
no different than writing, and no different than other things that he's going to do that are Chilul Shabbos.
Fine. Another question, which is slightly more personal, I guess, and it's a more individual question a person should ask their own Rav, but there is an option of less than full-time training, so a person can apply in order to work, let's say, instead of a 5-day week, a 4-day week, and in those circumstances, a person can sometimes, not always, avoid having to work on Shabbos. Now that leads to an extension to their training, so it takes a bit longer for them to train. It means they'll have the income will be less as well, depending on how much they will do. Are they 60, 80, or 90% of the full-time training? Is that something that a person should do lechatchila, or does it always depend on individual circumstances?
So, it depends on the circumstances, but definitely if it will compromise a person's financial situation, then it's something that, then he can do the regular training, especially if by doing so, he's still not guaranteed that he doesn't have to go on Shabbos.
Can a Hatzalah member return from outside of the Tchum after a call out to an out-of-town hospital?
Yes, that's the halacha of the Tiras Soifa Mishum Tchiloson discusses Chutz L'Tchum. That's the case in the Shulchan Aruch. But in most cases today, it's all within the city. But if a person is called out to a different city, yes, they can come back, not only because they may be needed, but also not to deter them from going. And that's a fact, okay? That's a fact that I know from the Hatzalah members in New York that they always make a cheshbon which hospital to take the patient based on how long it takes for them to get out of there. In other words, in New York City, the Hatzalah member has to make sure that the guy is sort of checked in, whatever you want to call it, admitted. I don't know exactly, but it can take a very long time, and it's a cheshbon. In other words, a Hatzalah member will think twice. Maybe I'll take him to a different hospital because there it's not such a hassle. So you do see that, yes, people are very much into saving lives, and people do tremendous amount of work. You see the tremendous Mesiras Nefesh and the tremendous devotion, but nevertheless, a human being is a human being, and when in their mind it doesn't really compromise the patient, they will make a personal cheshbonos, and that's something which Chazal took into account.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed once again to Rabbi Bixenspanner.
There's a few more questions.
No, I think that was it, all the ones in the box.
No, I think there's a few more.
Oh, just one final one. If you went by car, beheta, and you need to return now, but you might need to use your own car during Shabbos, are you then allowed to return?
Yeah, so this is something that all depends on the circumstances. In other words, I want to tell you a story that I witnessed with my own eyes. And, as much as it was very hard for me to sort of accept, but that's the fact. So, in New York, you have, Hatzalah is very extensive. You have in Borough Park, in Williamsburg, in Lakewood, but you also have Hatzalah in the Catskills. Now, the Catskills is an area that's literally, I'm not talking about square miles. I'm talking about the distance from one, the Catskills starts approximately, exit 118 on Route 17. It goes all the way to exit 96. We're talking about, 40 miles distance in not square miles. I'm talking about actual distance from the parameters. Now, because of that, in the Catskills, they don't have a system of goyim, or not always, not everywhere do goyim drive back cars. Many times, the members themselves drive back the cars. Now, I once witnessed someone was having a apparent heart attack in the place where we were. So, we called Hatzalah, and two members pulled in, and in a way that, they pulled into a wall. So the only way for them to go out is by backing up. Then two other members came behind them, and, they were treating this guy, and Baruch Hashem, they stabilized him. Now the two members went with him to the hospital, and the two cars were blocking, as I said before, right? Four members came, two went in first, and two followed them behind them. The two guys took their car, moved it out of the way, in order for them to be able to move their car, and then they went to the hospital. And it bothered me. I said, I never heard such a thing, that, you know, you're not driving back. You're not, all you're doing is you're moving your car, that the other members should be able to move their car later. But, you know, I guess I inquired, I spoke to the Rabbonim. So they said that because of the vast distances, it's impossible to have a goy, because you can wait, you know, all night until they're available to come and pick up your car. So the way they do it is that the members themselves drive back the car, and the heter is because it's so spread out, and because there aren't so many members available, so they rely on the fact that you'll need a car yourself, and because you're a Tzala member. In other words, it's not something that's a maybe. You know, statistically, every Shabbos, you know, he has multiple calls, so that's a heter. So every case is different. But if a person is in a situation where by waiting he's compromising a possibility of having of being able to respond, then that's an option. But again, you know, that's, you know, as a general rule. And someone wrote that electric cars also have sparks. So be'etzem, it's not much of a gain. It's a bit less. So obviously, if it's a bit less, then, you know, it makes it more of a derabanan, and making it more on the of a derabanan is making it more of a derabanan is definitely an option. Now someone mentioned here about the concept of hutra or the chuya. Now that's a very, you know, big sugya, and most poskim hold that pikuach nefesh on Shabbos is only the chuya.
I think we answered all the questions.
Yeah, okay. And if anyone wants, they can send questions to Dr. Kahan, and Metzram will forward it to me, or you can send it direct to me. And the Metz Hashem, the next time, whenever that will be, we'll continue a bit, you know, to explain. I think that what we're trying to achieve with these shiurim is more setting up a system, setting up of how a person should conduct themselves, a doctor, and what should be the priorities, and where they should look away, and not engage in chumras that, as we see in Chazal, chumra da asalidei kula, which means that if this chumra will drive him over the edge, because, you know, it puts him in a very uncomfortable position, then there's definitely room to be makel on certain things. And if a person knows, you know, what's the Raisa, what's the Rabbanon, trade the Rabbanon, so all these things, by understanding the Yisoides, by understanding the concepts, that can help people, you know, make certain decisions and apply it to their practical applications in their own setting and in their own situation. In the meantime, I want to thank again Dr. Kahan for giving me this opportunity, and for the people, for the Olam listening. And I just want to wish everyone a good evening. Kol Tov.
Thank you.
Good evening, Yashikaya.
Thank
you,
Thank
Rebbe.
you very much. Kol Tov.
Thank you very much, Koich.